Hi, I'm Mark David Gerson. Welcome to Stories and Reflections, where my stories are also yours. In the prologue to my novel, The Moon Quest, the main character, Toshar, is an old man, and he's visited by an otherworldly entity, a dreamwalker, and he's urged to tell his story, to tell the story of the Moon Quest that he traveled as a youth. And he's very reluctant. Well, I may have been as reluctant as Toshar back then to tell my stories, but I'm not now. At the same time, I'm experiencing something else that Toshar talks about in that prologue. In the prologue, he says, I don't know what to write. The story has so many beginnings and no clear ending. And that's kind of the truth of every story. I mean, we start a story at a certain point, but that certain point is really only the arbitrary point we choose. Because stories truly have no beginning and no clear ending. And I sure realized that today when I came up with a story I wanted to tell you, because I really don't know where to start. This story, like all stories, has no clear beginning and no clear ending. So I guess I will have to be arbitrary about it and just start somewhere and go forward and backward until I come to some sort of conclusion. Even as if with all stories, that isn't truly the ending because, as I say in The Bard of Bryn Dune, which is the fourth book in the Legend of Katana series that starts with the Moon Quest, stories never end. Well, maybe the best way to illustrate that is with the story of how the Bard of Bryn Dune came to be. So I'd written the Moon Quest, which originally was only one book, and that was the end of it. There was no series. But at a certain point, I recognized that there would be two other books, and there would be a series, the Star Quest and the Sun Quest. And when the Sun Quest was finished, everything seemed to be neatly wrapped up, and the Quintana trilogy, as I was then calling it, was over. Well, cut to a few years later, when I'm living in Portland, I wake up one morning and I have this really strong feeling that there's another story in the series. And it kind of baffles me because, again, when the Sun Quest ends, the bad guys are vanquished, the good guys triumph, and everyone seems to be living happily ever after. So, to be honest, I'm kind of skeptical because there just seems to be nowhere to go from where the Sun Quest ends. But I sit down and I start to write, figuring I'll write a scene, an opening scene to this book, and I'll see if it really is a story. Now, no, I have no plan for this scene. I just sit down and start to write. And like I've said before, I think this is how all my books evolve. There's no outline, I just start. So I sit down to write, and what comes to me is this scene where a young boy is being told a bedtime story by his mother. The young boy's name is Para. And this takes place many generations after the Moon Quest, Star Quest, Sun Quest sequence. And in this story that, in the moment, I don't think is a story, in this scene, the events of the Moon Quest, Star Quest, and Sun Quest are myth and history. Stories that have been passed down over many, many years, generations even, since the events in them took place. And for this young boy, this Para, the Moon Quest, Star Quest, and Sun Quest stories are among his favorite bedtime stories. But his all-time favorite is the Sun Quest. And so his mother starts to tell him the story, the bedtime story. Now, whenever his mother has told him a story, a bedtime story in the past, he's always fallen asleep before she gets to the end. This time, for the first time, he's still awake when the story is over, and she says, the end. And when she says the end, Para opens his eyes, sits up, and says something like, I don't think so. No, it isn't the end. And remember, this is all just coming to me as I'm writing it. I haven't thought any of it out beforehand. The story is evolving on the screen as I'm typing it. So his mother says, no, it is the end. It's the only end I know. It's the Sun Quest story that was told to me by my mother and told to her by her mother. It's the only Sun Quest story there is, and this is the only ending. Well, then Para recalls a scene from the Moon Quest story, as it is told to him again and again since he was little. And in that scene, he points out, or rather he asks, doesn't Eulisha tell Toshar in the Moon Quest story that stories never end, that they always continue? And when Perra says that to his mother, when I type those words, I'm stunned. Because if Perra is right, and Elisha is right, and the Moon Quest is right, and the story I wrote for the Moon Quest is right, then the story, the Quintana story, doesn't end with the Sun Quest. And this scene that I'm writing, must be the continuing. So I kept writing, and The Bard of Bryndoon, the fourth book in what was no longer a trilogy, I could have jokingly called it the untrilogy, The Bard of Bryndoon, was born. And in fact, now I'm working on the fifth book in what is now called The Legend of Quintana, and I already know the title of the sixth book. But let's go back to the story I wanted to tell you today. And this story goes back not as far as the Moon Quest story goes back for Perra and his mother. This story goes back to May 1998. And so it's May 1st, 1998. I'm living in Sedona. I've been here since September. I arrived after a 3-month open-ended journey, very much like Toshar's journey in the Moon Quest. And I think I talked a bit about that in a previous episode. So I wake up this May day, this 1st of May, this Beltane in the Celtic calendar. I wake up early and I can't get back to sleep. I can't get back to sleep because I'm feeling frustrated and angry and annoyed because in my mind, my life is not playing out the way I had intuited it would. After all, I've been in Sedona for 9 months and nothing about my life seems to have changed. So why am I in Sedona? Why, in fact, did I leave Toronto all those months ago? What am I doing here? It just feels to me as though I'm marking time. So I pick up the phone, I call a friend, and I bitch about my life. And she's sympathetic, but what she does is she urges me to go see a particular psychic reader in town. And of course, Sedona is filled with psychic readers, but she says, go to this one. He's someone who's really helped her in the past. And she says, I'm sure he can help you. I'm skeptical, but I call anyhow, certain I won't get a quick appointment. But the gods must have been smiling on me that morning because I do, for early that afternoon. I'll save the specifics of that session for another time because they are interesting, but I don't want to take up time today for that. But I will say that when I leave his place an hour later, it feels as though something major has shifted for me. I'm not sure what, but I know I don't feel quite as hopeless and helpless as I'd felt when I woke up. It was May 1st, Beltane, the Celtic feast of fertility, and I had been invited to go to a bonfire that night. But I'd been feeling so pissy when I got up that morning that I had decided not to go. But when I left the reader's house that afternoon, I decided I would go after all. So that night, I drive to Cathedral Rock in Sedona, and I hike up to the bonfire site. And I've barely settled in front of the fire when 2 women walk into the light created by the fire. I recognized one of them as someone I had been introduced to when I first got to Sedona 9 months earlier. And we started chatting, without going into that detail either, but I'll come back to it another time. We were married 7 weeks later. And that was that moment at the bonfire, where everything changed, where everything in my life changed. And that's kind of what I want to talk about, those moments in our lives when everything changes, where nothing is ever the same again. And it seems like it happens in an instant. There's a song in the musical Hello, Dolly that starts, well, the title is, It Only Takes a Moment. And yes, it does only take a moment. But you've heard of the overnight success that was years in the making? Well, the moment of shift is also often years, decades in the making. And that moment at that Beltane fire for me too was decades in the making. Because yes, in that moment there was a huge shift and my life was never the same. I fell in love. I got married. I had a daughter. I had a new country. Now the marriage ended 6 years later, but it was a profound and amazing experience. And of course, I have an amazing daughter because of it. But that story did not begin on May 1st, 1998. It didn't begin at the bonfire. It didn't begin when I walked out of that reader's house that afternoon. It didn't even begin when I woke up that morning feeling all pissy. Did it begin 9 months earlier when I arrived in Sedona after 3 months of seemingly random, certainly not random journeying? Did it begin the previous June when I left Toronto? Did it begin with my spiritual awakening a few years before that? I can't tell you, because stories have no real beginning. Stories have no real ending. So I couldn't know in any of those previous moments what was going to happen on May 1st, 1998, or what was going to happen after that. In those previous weeks, months, years, decades, all I could do was trust the journey. All I could do was trust from moment to moment, to trust what I was called to be, where I was called to go, who I was called to be, how I was called to be, and to trust, to know from some deep place of inner knowingness that is deeper and wiser than our logical minds can ever know or even understand. That if I trust in the moment, if I take the step of the moment, even if it doesn't make sense in the moment, it will lead me to that moment of shift. It will lead me to that moment where nothing is ever the same again. It will lead me to another Beltane bonfire experience. And of course, that Beltane bonfire experience, as I said, so radically changed my life that nothing was ever the same again. But nothing was ever the same again, not because I went to that Beltane bonfire when I had previously decided I wasn't going to go. Nothing was ever the same because I trusted in the journey. I had trusted in the journey. I trusted in my inner knowingness. I listened, and when things did not make sense, and so often in my life they have not made sense, I listened and trusted and followed and acted and took one of the leaps of faith I talked about last time. So why am I telling you this story today? And I'm asking that for myself as much as I am readying an answer for you. I think because in my life right now, it feels like I'm waiting for one of those Beltane moments. One of those moments of shift where everything changes so radically and so dramatically that life after that moment is not only not the same as life before that moment is no longer recognizable. And I'm realizing as I tell this story, as I share all this with you, that when that moment of shift comes, and I know it won't be out of the blue. It can't be out of the blue because it will have grown from all the other choices I have made. Choices I have not made from my thinking mind. Choices I've made from my intuitive mind. Choices I've made to follow the story I'm living as much as the story I'm writing, to follow the story wherever it takes me. And that's a scary roller coaster kind of journey, and one that the mind bridles at, because so many of those intuitive choices in the moment make no sense, can't be deconstructed in any way that makes any kind of logical sense, that makes any kind of conventional sense. And yet when we listen from those deep, deep, deep places within us, those places that are not logical, those places that defy, I won't say conventional wisdom because convention is rarely wise, I'll say conventional logic. When we take those leaps not only of faith, but of imagination, when we take those leaps beyond imagination, what emerges is beyond anything we could have dreamt. And so back to the story of the Bard of Bryn Dune. I was very skeptical, as I said, when I sat down to write that scene. In fact, I sat down to write that scene to prove that there was not another story in the series. I sat down to write that scene to prove that the story had ended with the Sun Quest, and that was it. And then my story through my character, through Purav, the little boy, used my words from the Moon Quest to show me it wasn't true. And I wrote The Bard of Bryn Dune. It was a hard book to write. It was a hard book to write because it's told in a way I had never, ever told a story before. And I was so insecure about it. So terrified that it was really, really, really bad. You see, unlike the Moon Quest and the Star Quest and the Sun Quest, which are each told from the first-person point of view of the main character of each of those stories, this story, this Bard of Bryn Dune, turned out to be told from many first-person perspectives. And as I wrote it, I was convinced It was horrible. I was convinced that all these characters would end up sounding the same. I was convinced that the story would just be too confusing. I was convinced that it was probably the worst book I had ever written. But I trusted, not easily, often grudgingly, and I wrote the story as it came to me. I told the story that wanted to be told, and I sent it out once it was done with great, great, great trepidation. And you know what? One of the first comments that came back to me said, "This is the best book you have ever written." And you know why it was the best book I'd ever written? It was the best book I'd ever written because I got out of the way and I trusted the story. When I traveled those 3 months from Toronto that ended up landing me in Sedona, not planned, I didn't plan to be in Sedona, and once there, I didn't plan to stay. But in trusting the day-to-day journey from Toronto that ultimately landed me in Sedona, and in trusting the signs and signals and synchronicities that got me to stay in Sedona, and in all those moments of trust through all those months and years, all of them led me to May 1st, 1998, and led me to that bonfire, the bonfire that changed everything. But it wasn't the bonfire that changed everything, of course. It was every moment that changes everything. Every moment of trust, every leap of faith, every time I said yes, every time I moved forward, even when I was scared. I've talked about Madeleine L'Engle before, and she was such an influence on me, and not only because of her Wrinkle in Time books. She was a deeply spiritual woman, and so much about her life touched me profoundly. And in one of her memoirs, she talks about all the Old Testament prophets who had been given their instructions, by the big guy upstairs, instructions that really made no sense. It may even have seemed impossible. And these Old Testament prophets, she writes, would lift their faces up to the heavens and they'd raise their arms to the skies and they'd shout, "You want me to do what?" Because it made no sense. Because whatever they were being asked to do seemed doomed to failure. And yet, in the end, they surrendered. And so, the voice of our heart, the voice of our intuition, the voice of our higher self, the voice of God, whatever you call it, it's that innate wisdom, that indwelling wisdom we all carry, that we all have access to if we choose to listen to it. And when we do listen to it, when we trust it, even though we're scared, even though it makes no sense, even though it defies all conventional logic, even though people may laugh at us. I think about the movie Evan Almighty with Steve Carell, where he plays an ambitious newscaster turned congressman whose life is turned upside down when God, played by Morgan Freeman, tells him to prepare for an impending flood by, guess what? By building an ark. And of course, he's resistant. But in the end, he surrenders. And in the end, the guidance proves correct because in the end, there is some kind of flood. He's like one of those Old Testament prophets that Madeleine L'Engle talks about, who at first throws up his hands in the air and says, you gotta be kidding. This is insane. And finally surrenders, finally says yes. And the guidance, the intuition, the call is proven correct. And nothing is ever the same. And so again, when we trust moment to moment, day by day, and listen for the voice of our story, the story we're living as much as the stories we're writing. I couldn't have planned to be living in Sedona because it was never a place I thought I would ever want to live or could live. And how I ended up at that Beltane bonfire, well, there's a whole series of decisions and choices and pieces of nonsensical guidance over my months in Sedona that got me there. One of those choices even was maybe when I crossed the border. And I think I may have told that story when I crossed the border from Ontario into Minnesota. What I didn't tell you is that when I got to the border crossing, I kind of looked hippy trippy, long hair, everything I owned in the back of a van. And the guy at the border crossing wanted to take everything out of my van. But I knew, even though I was anxious, somehow I knew that it would be okay. And it was. And I was. And that decision, too, got me to that bonfire, to that moment where everything changed. That moment that required so many other moments to get me there. Here's what I want to leave you with. Trust your story. If you're writing a story like I was with the Bard of Bryndoon, trust that. But whether you're writing a story or not, you're living a story. We all are. So trust that story. Trust it to take you to that moment where everything changes. And even though you cannot see the map, the point-by-point itinerary that gets you there, it's our job to trust that it's there in each moment of choice, as we follow the guidance, follow the breadcrumbs that carry us there. And so as I sit here waiting for my next moment that changes everything, I too have to remember that every choice I am making right down to this podcast episode today is another step on the journey that takes me to that point where everything changes, to that moment of shift where nothing is ever the same again. It's happened before, multiple times. It'll happen again. It'll happen again if I let it. And it'll happen for you if you let it. Thanks for joining me for Stories and Reflections today. I hope you found moments in my stories that touched something in yours. If you haven't already, be sure to subscribe so you don't miss future episodes. And for more of my stories and help telling yours, check out my books at markdavidgerson.com or from online booksellers worldwide. Until next time, don't forget that you're a storyteller too, and keep telling your stories. The intro and outro music for today's episode is Heartwarming by Kevin MacLeod from Incompetech.com, licensed under Creative Commons.